I just want to welcome you again at our the seminal series, the distinguished series in energy that the Texas A&M Energy Institute is organizing. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, very distinguished guest. It's our own colleague, in fact, Professor Gabriel Eckstein, who is an internationally renowned lawyer, especially for environmental regulation, with emphasis on water resources and resources in general. Gabriel is, apart from professor of law at our School of Law, which is located in Fort Worth, Dallas area. He also directs a program of energy, environmental and natural resources systems, and the Clinic for Environmental and Natural Resources. They do like studies, and we receive the reports. And many of us have seen those reports. Which essentially look at the interfaces of how policy, regulation, and law can impact technology, which is something which is very important to consider, especially nowadays as we reshape the energy transition space, right? He works very closely and advises regularly United Nations agencies, national and some national governments, non-government organizations, and other groups on all those very subtle issues, not very well understood issues, of managing, water resources. We think always of energy, we forget the water in the plane. Today, he's going to speak on a topic that also not very well understood, and we're really looking forward to him demystify some of those issues. We have a big program at Texas A&M on geothermal energy, mostly about technologies and how to, what to do and how to ensure that the geothermal energy becomes a technical feasibility reality. But there is another subtle issue that we hope Gabriel will entertain for us. Who owns the heat? So let us warmly welcome Professor Gabriel Eckstein.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity, the invitation to come speak in this program at the Energy Institute, and to all of you. So as Stratos explained, I've been focusing on water issues most of my career, and this has a very strong water component, geothermal energy, very strong water component. I'm not ready yet to deal with the water of it yet, of geothermal, because when I started looking into geothermal energy, I was blown away, and I'll talk a little bit about, I was blown away by the potential as an energy source. And I was very interested in the water component of it. But I got stuck on understanding, well, how does it work? And how does it work as a business, investing in geothermal energy? How does it work as a natural resource in terms of, well, who gets it? Who has a right to it? Because when you have natural resources, some company or some government or some agency is the one that says, well, we have the right to do this and that. We can exploit it. We can develop it. We can manage it. We can move it, transfer it. And the more I learned about geothermal energy, the more I got confused, because water I can capture. I can take the water from the ground, from the river, from aquifers, and I can touch it, right? And I can use it directly for water. I can drink it. I can use it in my industrial operations and so on. Oil and gas, the same way. Coal, lithium, trees, every aspect of environment. But geothermal energy is thermal energy. It's not a thing. It's a characteristic. It's a property of something else. So if you have hot rock, well, the heat in the rock is the geothermal energy, is the thermal energy. How do you capture the heat? Well, you've got the rock. You can say, hey, I captured the rock. It's hot. I can use the hot rock. Well, yes, but okay, you own the rock, but you own the heat that's in there. You can use the rock to heat things up, right? Gives you warmth. But can you transfer that heat? Do you own that heat when it's underneath your feet? Who owns it? If you own the land, does that mean you own the heat? But you can't contain heat. You can't control it. The heat's going to go wherever, at least resistance. So it might flow to your neighbor's property. So is it mine, mine, mine? Oh, now it's yours. Now it's unclear because it's not like water. Water, at least you can capture. You can't necessarily corral it underground. In rivers, you can. We put dams all the time. Heat's a little bit different. Thermal energy is a little different. So this is where I kind of got a bit confused about what it means in terms of a natural resource, in terms of an investment opportunity, in terms of how do you regulate a thing that you can't control? And so this is what this is focusing. So eventually I want to get back to the water part of geothermal, but not today. Right now, it's just sort of to me, this is sort of the foundation in terms of, let's see, here we go. The foundation of what do we do with this heat? And I'm looking at this, from the idea that I'm completely shocked why we don't use more geothermal energy around the world. And I'm not a businessman, but I do understand a little bit about business in terms of, well, if private sector is not interested in it, maybe it's not good. But I think it's a good thing. Why aren't they interested? And so I'm trying to figure out what's going to incentivize the private sector. And one of the things that I'll very briefly talk about, I'm not an economist, but I know enough to say that for a free market system, you have to have property rights. And if you can't figure out what the property right is, the business is not going to invest. And so this is sort of my underlying premise is that I need to have some kind of property rights in geothermal, and I have to figure that out so I can convince the private sector to invest. But I have to think, well, this characteristic, I don't know what it is. I can't touch it. How do I define ownership in something that doesn't have a physical form, right? So there's a lot of components here. On some of these that I'm going to be talking about, and some of these I'm just going to skim very, very cursorily, just because we don't have enough time. You're welcome to my slides, and I want to try to get to my end game, which today is where I think how I think we should regulate geothermal energy in terms of ownership. And I'm going to be very specific. In the US. In the US, we are very property oriented, very, very market oriented. My proposal may not fit for other parts of the world. So this is very focused on the way we do business in the US. So just that caveat. All right. So just first background, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but when you think of geothermal, you think of geysers, right? You think of the geologic faults where the plates come together and you have the volcanoes. This is in fact a very minor part of the potential geothermal energy. Geothermal energy is this power that comes from the center of the earth, from what we call primordial heat, heat that still exists from 4 billion years ago, that is still coming out from the formation of the universe, formation of the planets, and so on, and also radioactive decay. That's your main source. There's some other sources of heat from the convection processes and the heat transfer processes between the layers and so on. But it's the radioactive and the primordial heat. That's your main sources. And the amount of heat is, to me, it's just insane. It's incredible. So much heat available that I can't even comprehend what it means. I mean, within the top 10,000 meters, okay, 33,000 feet, 50,000 times more heat energy contained in all the world's oil and natural gas resources combined, renewable. constantly being renewed on, and they're saying maybe for the next 2 billion years. So, I mean, this is just an incredible amount of energy that we haven't even begun to tap globally. I'm not going to dwell on all these. The point is there's just a significant amount of heat, and you can use it at a shallow level with heat pumps. 30 feet below the surface, in most of the US, the temperature is the same, right around 55, 60 degrees Fahrenheit, consistent. And with heat exchangers, you can produce heat and cooling for buildings, for homes. And there's a cost issue here it's a little more costly than your air source heat pumps or your oil and gas furnaces. But the energy output is estimated at 300 to 600%. 300 to 600% more than your typical gas or oil, certainly more than oil. Gas is a bit more efficient, but it doesn't replace electricity, but it reduces electricity reliance, because all you're doing is you're running this system. You're not using electricity to heat the house. You're using electricity just to run the system, and that heats and cools the house. And so it is so efficient that within a matter of 10 years, you've already recouped your costs. And the systems can last 25 to 50 years. That's for ground source heat pumps. If you want to, and if you look across, this is just a heat map of the US in terms of ground temperatures. So this can be done in heat pumps can be used in most parts of the US. But if you want to go deeper, which is where I think the real potential is in terms of large scale heat production or energy production, if you dig down anywhere in the world, whether it's underneath the seabed, in any mountainous region, any plateau, any low valley, if you dig deep enough, you're going to hit heat. Maybe 2 miles, maybe 5 miles, 6 miles, and you may say, oh my God, that's really deep. Not for the oil and gas industry. They're already doing this every day. So we have the technology. We have the know-how how to drill this deep. Now it's an issue. How do we harness the heat, capture it in an economical way? And the costs have been reduced. The problem is, I don't think there's enough investment in this technology, in this approach, to further reduce the cost and make it more equivalent to conventional sources. I think it's absolutely doable, and the potential is just enormous. The potential is enormous. This is just a heat map of the US. You can dig anywhere in the US, right? You look at these yellows, you're already getting to 150 C, right? And this is at 4.5 miles below the surface. You can produce electricity even below 100 C, depending on heat exchangers that you're using. But if you can do this anywhere in the US. You can do this anywhere in the world, literally. And it's just an issue of we just haven't ramped up the technology and the research into this. Around the world, 32 countries are using geothermal. Usually it's the ones that are on the rifts in the geologic zones and the volcanic zones, Iceland, Japan, those, we have it in California, those areas. But the amount we're producing is just a fraction of electricity and heat in general around the world. It's been ramping up, it's been increasing, but nowhere near the potential. I think the potential is just, exponentially more than where it is today. Right now in the US, geothermal is 0.4% of total electricity generation. And again, it's a potential issue. So my concern with this is, well, why aren't we doing more? Why aren't we developing into the space? High upfront costs, absolutely. But that's an issue of knowledge. We just don't know enough. We haven't developed the right technologies to be able to go to that depth, capture it in a certain way where it becomes economical. We already know we have the technology because oil and gas industry has it. And now it's just an issue of reapplying the technology in an economical way. I have to say, I keep having people going up to me and saying, wait a minute, I had to go into Wikipedia to see what geothermal is. People just don't know what it is. They don't know what geothermal energy is. They don't know how it's used, what the potential is, how it can be accessed. So there's a big education gap that I think is going to have an impact on financial resources and the availability of financial resources, subsidies, investments, grants, and so on. So we have to work on. Of course, I'm just focusing on the legal part, and I'm just focusing on one small component. I'll briefly talk about the legal structure that is in existence right now, but I will tell you up front, big picture, there's very little law in place for geothermal. There's very little regulation because we don't have experience. Well, we've never needed it, so we don't have the rules. And so if a company is trying to come in, I'm sure they would love to see, oh, no regulation, we can do whatever we want. But high upfront costs, they don't necessarily know. The oil and gas industry doesn't know about geothermal. There's an education gap with the oil and gas industry. Technology. So all these combined have actually created a barrier for companies to go into the sector to invest. Even governments, even a government that wants to go on their own private, we have federal lands, right? They could invest on geothermal on federal lands. But what do they get out of it? They haven't even started to evaluate the return on investment at the governmental level, what it could provide the population or the communities or society and so on. So this is why I'm focusing on ownership, because I just think it's at the foundation of all these issues that could incentivize the private sector, the government, and so on. And as I said, it's indispensable for a market system. This may not, my discussion here today may not work well for Scandinavia, for example, where you have some resources privately owned, some resources are publicly owned. Geothermal, I just learned in Norway, geothermal is privately owned. So it might work in Norway, but other places where it's a public resource, where the government owns it on behalf of the population, some of what I'm going to say may not fit there, but we need to have a discussion about this. And I think we need a discussion even at a global level. My understanding, and I'm just starting to learn about what's happening in Europe, they're quite a bit ahead of us in terms of dealing with geothermal and regulating geothermal. But this is something that I'm not going to get into. But for our system, for companies to invest, they need understanding. They need understanding of the laws and what the investment potential will be. And to do that, they have to know what they're going to get. What is the thing that they're going to get that they can then sell and make money on? Well, they've got to own something that they can then sell, right? And if you don't know what you're going to own when you deal with geothermal, they're not going to get into the market. So, real briefly, from a legal point of view, ownership, when I teach my law students, I sort of separate it as ownership, there's control, there's dominion. These are different ideas that you can actually talk about. You can have control over something and not own it. You can have dominion, just slightly different than control, but very similar, and still not own it. You can own something but have no control over it. We need to figure out what exactly can you do with geothermal resources in a way that it becomes ownership of a thing, property, that then can be controlled, so that the private sector or the public sector can then sell, lease, do something with the thing, and then say, yeah, I can invest in it and I can make money on this. Because remember, the potential is huge in terms of the energy production of energy. We don't own air. So is geothermal the same thing as air? Birds and fish? Well, there's some rules about, well, if it's in you know, if you have a wild animal in your backyard, you don't own that wild animal. Maybe the state has some rights to that wild animal, but do they, in some states they own it, some other states they don't own it. And the reason I'm bringing up air, birds, fish, I'm looking for examples from other things that are owned either in a different way than we own oil or water or cars or books. And I'm trying to see, well, is there anything that I can learn from these other things like air? There's no ownership of air. How do we protect air? Well, we don't always do it in the best way. Do I want to protect geothermal energy? Well, it's not that I want to protect it, I want to use it. So, well, air is not quite the same thing. Well, how about wind? Well, who owns the wind? That's a little closer. We're trying to use the energy from the wind. So I'm trying to learn from these other examples in terms of what other industries have done, and see if I can apply it to geothermal. The problem I keep having, as I said at the very, very beginning, it's non-physical, non-tangible, can't be broken down into smaller components. You can't contain it. It's fugacious. I had to look this up. It took me a while to understand what fugacious means. It's mobile in a way. It's not gaseous, right? Gaseous is something related to the way gas moves. Fugacious means that it can escape. You can't contain it. It's the closest thing I can word that I can find it to describe what is geothermal, how geothermal energy or thermal energy moves. No mass or weight. It's a characteristic of something else. The rock is hot, right? The formation down below is hot. The water is hot. It's always in something else. So it's a characteristic of something. There's really no way to capture the thermal energy unless you convert it. You convert it into a container, a medium, or convert it somehow to electric energy. That we can control. We've learned how to capture that. By itself, it's a problem from a property point of view, from a legal point of view, trying to figure out how exactly we can own thermal energy. This is the part where it gets a little theoretical, because I started looking at what are the different ways you can own things under legal theory. And the main legal theories are these ones up here. Ad coelum, rule of capture, court law, which I'll talk about all of these. There's a number of non-private property, meaning it's public property or unowned property. So it's not private. These two are private, the rule of capture and ad coelum. And so these are the main doctrines. I'm not going to go in detail, as I would in my law course, but I will say this. Ad coelum and rule of capture gives you a proper ownership. Ad coelum basically says you own everything on your land from the center of the earth to the heavens. At least that's what they said 500 years ago. And right now we know we got airplanes flying over our property and we can't stop them. And in some places, not Texas, you don't own the groundwater. The state owns the groundwater. You might own the minerals and the oil and gas, but not the groundwater, because the state has decided that you don't have ad coelum for groundwater. Here in Texas, we're an exception in the US. Only 3 states, I think, have the same law as Texas. The rest of the states, groundwater is a state property, public property. So this doctrine has already been very whittled down. You have drone technology, right? Drones flying over your property. They're allowed to if they're at a certain elevation. Are they allowed to take pictures? That's at a certain elevation they are. But if they're under, I think it's under 400 feet, they're not allowed. Because we've decided that ad coelum, it's not to the heavens, it's only to 400 feet. So this is one type of legal doctrine. Rule of capture, you own it when you capture it. That's the purest form. In Texas, we have the rule of capture for groundwater, but we've connected it to an absolute ownership rule, which is similar to ad coelum. And so groundwater in Texas is rule of capture plus absolute ownership. So you own the groundwater, not because of this doctrine, but because of this doctrine in Texas, the rule of capture. The pure form of rule of capture is you don't own it until you capture it. And I'm going to come back to this one because we've used it with a couple other types of resources like oil and gas and groundwater here in Texas. And this is one that, like I said, I want to come back to later when I talk about geothermal, but this is two of the private property theories. I'm bringing up tort law now because it's connected to private property. So property law is a different legal area than tort law. Tort law is an area where you have injury. Somebody hurts you or injures your property or causes damages. Under property law, you can talk about interfering with your property rights. But the action is actually a tort law because if they cause harm to your property, now we're talking either a trespass or a nuisance. Trespass is when they come onto your land or they cause something to go on your land that causes that injury. Nuisance, they don't have to go on your land. They just blare their music, right? Or do something that makes you unable to enjoy your property. So these become property law doctrines, although they're tort law, but in the sense that how do you protect your property if it is your property? Meaning if you have ownership, hey, you can protect it through these ways, right? Except if I own geothermal energy and my neighbor starts to extract geothermal energy, how can I prevent him from taking mine? Hey, I can sue him. But physically, practically, how do I prevent it? So this may be all nice and everything, but I'm not sure it makes any sense for geothermal because of the nature, the characteristic of how geothermal works. So now we go to non-private property, public ownership, open access, public ownership. Common pool and public ownership, it basically means that some segment of the community owns it, either a small segment or everybody. Okay, but we've also heard of things like tragedy of the commons where, hey, if everybody owns it, nobody takes care of it. You can regulate it and reduce that kind of negative impact. And then open access, these are resources that cannot be regulated, like the open seas, the atmosphere. Nobody owns them. You can regulate them, but nobody owns them. But again, it's subject to tragedy of the commons. And my question is, well, could this apply to geothermal? And to me, this is somewhat more enticing, right? As a public resource, or maybe just nobody owns it. I'm worried about doing the same thing to geothermal that we did to oil and gas 100 years ago. And if you look at the history, the exploitation, the destruction of the subsurface and the surface as we exploited oil and gas, it was a free-for-all because, hey, we all owned it. Nobody cared. There were a few regulations in place at the time, or nobody owned it. And some states took different approaches to oil and gas. So it's enticing, but I'm a bit hesitant about this kind of approach. Where I want to go to where oil and gas is today in terms of how it's regulated and managed in a way that minimizes that environmental footprint. But I don't want to deal with oil and gas because I think there's some harmful side effects of oil and gas production and use. And that's why I want to get into geothermal. So current law with geothermal, as I said at the beginning, because I just gave you the doctrine, sort of the legal theories. Now I'm going to show you what it's actually in place at the federal law on federal lands. This is where you see the greens and the greens are federal lands. The browns on this map are tribal lands. for all intent, for all practical purposes, the government, federal government owns those lands, so they own whatever geothermal resources are there. Great, they can drill in the middle of any of these places and it's not gonna matter, they own it, they get the royalties or they get the benefits and so on. The problem that I have is they don't tell you how they own it. What is it, do they own it upon capture, do they own it in the ground? It doesn't, for practical purpose, it doesn't matter unless you get into the border of the federal land with a private property. Because then you can have cross-border impacts. And that's where it's necessary to know, well, how is it owned? So I'm not too concerned about federal lands. I'm more concerned with on private property. State-owned lands, the same thing. It's the same problem in terms of, I'm not too concerned with state-owned lands if they're big areas and the state decides to develop geothermal on those spaces. But where you get the border of the state-owned land with a private property, then you may have cross-border impacts. And well, wait a minute, how do you own it? You own it only when you capture it, or would you own it in the ground, or is it public ownership? Is it, is there private ownership on the private land? We don't know the answer. So right now, there's about a dozen states that implicitly say, not explicitly, implicitly say, they suggest that the state owns it. They don't say it outright. If it's on state land, 31 states, unclear, completely unclear. And again, they don't say how it's owned. Private lands in the US, there's a number of states that explicitly recognize that the geothermal resources are owned in the surface owner versus the others who say it's the mineral owner. Because here in the US, we can separate the surface estate from the mineral estate, right? Oil and gas, coal, that can be owned by somebody else that's different from the surface owner. Well, is geothermal a mineral? I don't think so. Does it have minerals in it? Could have minerals and extract? Yeah, it could. But should it be owned by the surface estate, or should it be separated as a mineral estate? If you lease away your mineral rights, does that new mineral owner get the geothermal component of that or not? We only have a few states that have suggested that. There's some other states that implicitly suggested it's a mineral estate. I actually don't care. I just want to know, well, if they own it, how do they own it? At what point do they own it upon capture? Or do they own it while it's in the ground? And if you own it, how does it give you access? Because you got to go through the surface, right? So does that also give you access to drill through somebody's private property, even though you don't own the surface? And what happens when you have a oil and gas owned by one person and geothermal owned by another person? And then you have to go through different layers, and well, you're interfering with somebody else's layer. And so we just don't have clarity on any of this in terms of the ownership and how it's owned. So this is where I get to sort of my proposal and what I think should be done. And I will tell you right now, I've not presented this to anybody yet. So you're the first. So I'm looking for feedback, and I understand that the audience here, not lawyers, but from a practical point of view, does it make sense? From a technical point of view, does my proposal make sense? Remember I said rule of capture? The idea that you only own it once you capture it, okay? Because I don't think you can own the thing in the ground when you can't grab it, you can't contain it, you can't put walls around it, prevent the energy from moving from your property to the next neighboring property. So I think the rule should be, you own it if you can capture it and control it. Well, what does controlling geothermal energy mean? You have to put it into some kind of medium, meaning rock, water, other fluid, or convert it to electricity, electric energy. That's the only way I know you can control it. So until you do that, I don't think you should have ownership. Now remember, I'm trying to incentivize the industry. So they might say, wait a minute, but if I don't own it when it's in the ground, why would I drill? Well, this hopefully gives you something that you can latch onto to say, hey, once you convert it, now you have a thing that you can sell. You own what you've created here. Electric energy, or you've converted it into hot water, and you can use it for district heating. Something along those lines. And there's no ownership in the heat or thermal energy while it's naturally in the ground. That's the basic premise, okay? What does this mean? The landowners, when you own your land, you do not have a right to the geothermal energy. You have a right to access it because it's your land. Nobody can go on your land and put a drill rig on there. Nobody can do anything on your land without your permission. So you have the right to exploit what's underneath your land, but you don't own it until you capture it. So again, from a private sector perspective, I think the companies would, if they can get enough space, somebody's, I don't know how many acres you would need to put up a drill rig for a geothermal plant. 10 acres, 20, 30 acres, maybe. That's not that large. You get enough landowners if they're carved up in small pieces, or you get some big ranch, and you get permission to drill there on that land. So really the only negotiation is the access for the company, is to get the access. And then they just have to have a sharing agreement with the landowner. Is it a royalty? Is it a flat fee? That's contractual. That's up to them to decide. They get the access, they get it if they can capture it. Ownership of native groundwater and minerals that are found in there, because you may be, if there may be hot water that already has minerals in it, and you may be extracting that. For my purposes right now, at the theoretical level, I want to separate those. Ownership of geothermal energy, ownership of groundwater, ownership of minerals. As a practical level, the agency that issues the permits, they may have to come up with some kind of mechanism that combines those. But at the theoretical level, until we get a handle of what exactly do you own when you own geothermal energy, I think we need to keep those separate. Notice here, this one actually is a big one, eliminating the tort claims. Remember that I can sue my neighbor because he's stealing my energy. No. It's not your energy. It's not your geothermal resources. You don't own it. Think about the company now that is drilling. They can drill without being concerned about the neighboring property suing them for stealing their energy resource, because it's a rule of capture. In fact, we do that already with oil and gas. We have this exact scenario with oil and gas reserves right now. We sometimes require unitization, and I'll show you in the next slide. Absolutely, we can unitize all sorts of parcels. We should be able for geothermal purposes. And then that would also eliminate the tort claims. But under the rule of capture, it already eliminates them, and I think gives the companies incentives to invest. When you have all this, you already are giving enough information, I think, enough information for the investors to say, now I know what I'm going to get, what I can potentially capture and then sell. I have enough information to know how to run this kind of business. It's a big investment cost to get into this business, but I think this is enough for them. Now, as I said, I don't think that it should be a purely unregulated rule of capture. There has to be regulations. So need to have a permit. There's got to be a permitting agency. There has to be extraction limitations. So the state or state agency needs to come up with a plan, a resource management plan. How much can you extract in a particular area? Most of these state agencies, well, they don't even exist. Or there's a state agency that just don't have a mandate for geothermal. They have mandates for other energy sources. So they don't have this information. So I think a lot of this information, I think it's on the next slide, has to come from the industry, that they're going to have to share their information. Setback requirements, from property lines and well spacing, which go to the extraction limitations. If you want to manage how much you're extracting and the rate of extraction, because you don't want to over extract and actually extract in excess of the natural replenishment rate. Here is, the submission of technical studies. Industries are just like in oil and gas, they're doing the studies. That should form the basis of the planning that the state's getting developed in terms of that geothermal basin, how much can we extract at what rate. Some of the information is going to have to come from industry. Industry should be sharing at least some of that information with the state agencies so that we can start planning and not overexploit and not do what we did with the oil and gas industry 100 years ago. Right now, we're in a much better place with oil and gas in terms of managing exploitation and maximizing efficiency. This is where I want to go with geothermal. And then I made the point that the unitization, that the state agency should have the opportunity, just like we do in Texas and most other states for oil and gas, to compel unitization if it's in the best interests of managing the resource. That's it.